This video is brought to you by Ground News. Last week saw perhaps the poshest event in England's social calendar, the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. Unfortunately for anyone involved, the race itself was overshadowed by a warning from the government that the winning team shouldn't throw their cocks into the water, as is custom, because the water in the Thames has dangerously high levels of E. coli. This is yet another symptom of chronic underinvestment in Britain's water system, which has been in a near-permanent state of crisis since its privatisation in 1989, and is reaching a fever pitch as the UK's biggest water supplier, Thames Water, currently flirts with bankruptcy. So in this video, we're going to explain why the UK privatised its water in the first place, what's gone wrong, and why this puts Sunak in a tough spot. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand this story, you need to go all the way back to 1989, when the Thatcher government decided to privatise the water system in England and Wales. This was pretty neoliberal, even by Thatcher's standards. The only other country with a similarly privatised water system is Chile, and that was implemented in the 80s by a military junta as part of what's now known as the neoliberal experiment, when General Pinochet hired a group of American economists known as the Chicago Boys to use Chile as basically a laboratory for neoliberal policies. Anyway, there were at least 3 reasons why most countries haven't privatised water. First, it's not a popular move politically, which is why the UK is the only democratic country to have done it. It was actually really unpopular when Thatcher did it in the UK, with polling showing that a substantial majority of Brits opposed it, but she did it anyway. Second, water is what's known in economics as a common pool resource, which basically means it's both scarce and very hard to stop people and companies from consuming it. This means that some people can overconsume it to the detriment of the overall good. Most economists accept that, because of this, common pool resources have to be at least regulated by the government, if not entirely nationalised. Third, like other utilities, water tends towards monopoly. This is basically because, wherever you live, there's usually only one water system supplying that area, which means that consumers can't shop around and put pressure on their water supplier to provide a better service. Even if a competitor wants to come along and build an entirely new alternative water system, this wouldn't really work because A, it would be ridiculously expensive, and B, the existing water system has probably already been built along all the best routes. So, given all this, why did Thatcher privatise water anyway? Well, it was in part because she was ideologically committed to neoliberalism. But it was also because the British water system needed a massive amount of investment that the British state just didn't think it could afford at the time. And well, to be fair to Thatcher, in this respect, privatisation originally looked like it had worked. Tens of billions of pounds were invested into the system, and the private sector did a good job in improving efficiency and the quality of Britain's water supply, which is today one of the cleanest in the world. Unfortunately, everything started to go wrong in the late 90s, and the system has been in a state of crisis ever since. There were basically 2 reasons for this. First, despite attempts by the government to simulate market pressures, water companies still have de facto monopolies. If you live in London, for instance, you're supplied by Thames Water, and that's that. This became glaringly obvious in 1995, when mismanagement by Yorkshire Water meant they basically failed to deal with a mild drought, and had to resort to sending tankers of water into affected areas and placing unprecedented restrictions on supply. This became a massive story in the media at the time, because Yorkshire Water's shortcomings had no negative effect on its share prices or profits, because, well, it's a monopoly. Second, the regulation that accompanied privatisation, including most notably the introduction of the UK's water regulator Ofwat, didn't work. Ofwat has always been torn between trying to keep consumer costs down while also guaranteeing strong enough returns to make water companies attractive investments for private capital. Unfortunately, it squared this circle by allowing water companies to do 2 things: invest less and borrow more. Investment collapsed in the 90s, and not a single large reservoir has been built in England for 30 years now. Similarly, between 2002 and 2018, Scottish Water, which remains publicly owned, invested on average nearly 35% more per household than its English equivalent, according to researchers at Greenwich University. While this underinvestment helped keep bills low, England's water system is now in urgent need of repair, which will cost an estimated £100 billion over the next 5 years. England now has one of the leakiest water systems in Europe, with 20% of all water being lost to leakage, compared to just 5% in Germany. Chronic underinvestment is also the main reason water companies have recently resorted to dumping unprecedented amounts of raw sewage into the UK's lakes and rivers, because England's obsolete sewer system is regularly overwhelmed. At the same time, water companies were allowed to borrow absurd sums of money. This was nominally about funding investment and keeping bills down in the short term, but a lot of the money just went straight into the shareholders' pockets. Shareholders have received over £70 billion in dividends since privatisation, and are still receiving billions every year despite the dire need for investment. The most glaring example of this was and is Thames Water, which was bought by a dodgy Australian conglomerate called Macquarie in 2006, who duly quadrupled Thames Water's debt burden from about £3 billion to nearly £11 billion by 2017. Despite this cash injection, Thames Water is still a mess, perhaps because roughly £3 billion just went to shareholders as dividends. Anyway, because more than half this debt was inflation-linked, rising prices and interest rates in the past few years have basically forced the company into restructuring negotiations. Basically, Thames Water is trying to convince its investors, a combination of Anglophone pension funds and Asian sovereign wealth funds, to give them a bit more time and a bit more money to sort things out. At the same time, both the investors and Thames Water are trying to convince Ofwat to sweeten the deal by agreeing to steeper price hikes for consumers and relaxing regulatory requirements. Unfortunately, because Thames Water is in such a mess, investors have apparently decided they'd prefer to cut their losses rather than give it any more money. This leaves the government in a bit of a pickle. Even if the investors take more of the losses, Thames Water will still need money for the necessary investments at some point, which would mean higher bills for its 16 million customers. The government won't want this so soon before an election, but the obvious alternative, nationalisation, would look like a tacit admission of failure and just shift the cost onto the government, whose finances are already under strain. When researching this topic, we found that it was really important to balance the different opinions on this topic. Fortunately, we were able to easily compare opinions thanks to our sponsor Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For example, take this story about the Thames water crisis we discussed today. Right away, you can see that the story had 9 outlets reporting on it, but of those, 50% leant right, while none lean left. Every story also comes with a detailed view of the bias distribution, factuality scores, and even specific ownership information. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to get a more detailed understanding of how reporting might change based on political bias. I especially like their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by either side of the political spectrum. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I cannot recommend it enough. I've become much better at spotting political bias, and I've surprisingly challenged some of my own views. In fact, if you subscribe today, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's $5 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.